Welcome to this brief talk about how we have arrived at where we are in paediatric dermatology. May I say at the outset that I have no commercial interests to declare. Nowadays, the term paediatric dermatology implies some understanding of both the principles and practice of paediatrics, as well as detailed knowledge of the skin and its diseases, from extreme prematurity through to adolescence. I will argue that paediatric dermatology is a specialty, but if you are a dermatologist or a paediatrician with an interest, perhaps for you it is a subspecialty. Nowadays, you are highly likely to have done a course. If you are mainly or wholly a paediatric dermatologist, you will probably have done a fellowship or even full training. I will look briefly at early history and will follow with some key publications and the creation of institutions that have furthered research and education in paediatric dermatology. Throughout, I will be referring to people who have made things happen. Although I have no commercial declaration, I do have an acknowledgement to make at the outset to John Harper, who has covered much of my subject in the third edition of his textbook. The earliest record of skin conditions and their treatments is on clay tablets recovered from the ancient city of Sumer in Mesopotamia, and there are descriptions of impetigo and vernix caseosa among others. Early Egyptian, Hindu and Greek texts also demonstrate that skin diseases were being recognized. Moving on to Roman times, Galen wrote a text on abnormal swellings in the skin. The Persian physician Rhazes wrote the first book on diseases of children and included eczema. In the 16th century, Mercurialis de morbis cutaneus is regarded as the first scientific approach to skin disease. Let's turn to the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain. Daniel Turner is regarded as the father of British dermatology, and some skin diseases of children are included. Robert Willan began a process of methodical description and systematic classification of skin disease, and this task was completed by his pupil, Thomas Bateman. Here is an illustration, probably in modern terminology, of atopic eczema from Bateman's Delineations of Cutaneous Diseases. Walter Dendy was the first author to publish a book specifically on skin disease in children. And this is therefore perhaps the first textbook of paediatric dermatology. The next milestone in publishing was not until 1960, when Henry Perlman published his Paediatric Dermatology. Perlman had a long and complex career, beginning as a pharmacist, qualifying in medicine, specializing in pediatrics and then in dermatology. And for the next 4 decades of his career, he devoted himself entirely to paediatric dermatology. He taught the subject in a number of institutions in Philadelphia, and in 1985 he was made the only honorary member of the American Society of Pediatric Dermatology. His book was reviewed in this country in the British Medical Journal in 1961 by probably the only paediatric dermatologist in this country at that time, Dr. Edmund Moynihan. In his review, Moynihan described the book as excellent and much needed. He goes on to say that it would be valuable for all who deal with children, whether a student, trainee or more experienced paediatrician. Interestingly, dermatologists weren't mentioned. He regarded the book as well balanced and his views orthodox, but did highlight an interesting difference between the American and British approach to infantile hemangioma. At that time in Britain, it was standard practice to wait for natural resolution, but in the US, surgery, radiotherapy or freezing were frequently used. He went on to say that the chapter on the newborn was perhaps too short. Moynihan concludes on a very positive note and said, "We may be sure that further editions will be called for," but sadly there weren't any. I will now move on to the first institution in our history. This is the International Society of Paediatric Dermatology, the forerunner of national and regional societies. It was set up by a group of dedicated paediatric dermatologists who were known to one another. The instigator was Ramon Ruiz Maldonado, and the location, the San Angel Inn in Mexico City. A little more about Ruiz Maldonado. He had a background in pathology and dermatology, was widely travelled and fluent in several languages. In 1970, he'd been appointed head of Paediatric Dermatology at the National Children's Hospital of Mexico in Mexico City. And in 1972, with his colleague Lourdes Tamayo, he had created the first university-based formal course in paediatric dermatology. Here is a list of the other paediatric dermatology enthusiasts gathered at the San Angel Inn. I will pick out those who feature later in this talk. Firstly, Martin Beer. He was at the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Belfast and also at the Belfast Hospital for Sick Children. He was later a president of the BAD in the early 1980s. Coleman Jacobson, a paediatric dermatologist in Texas and a co-founder of the American Society for Paediatric Dermatology. Edmund Moynihan, the dermatologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital, also at Guy's Hospital in London. Lawrence Solomon, a paediatric dermatologist in Chicago, one of the first with an interest in neonatal dermatology, and published a book in the same year, 1973, and went on with his colleague Nancy Esterly to be a co-editor of our journal. And finally, Kazuya Yamamoto, the founder of the Japanese Society for Paediatric Dermatology. As well as instigating the International Society, Ruiz Maldonado organized the first International Symposium, also in 1973. He hosted 2 World Congresses in Mexico City and went on to have a major influence throughout Latin America and indeed worldwide. He was a founding member and General Secretary of the International Foundation for Dermatology, and like a number of British dermatologists, taught yearly at the Regional Dermatology Training Centre in Moshi in Tanzania. He wrote an important textbook of paediatric dermatology together with Lawrence Parrish from the USA and Martin Beer from the UK. Since it began, his department has given a full 3-year residency training to over 130 individuals and had many visiting fellows spending a shorter time. One of those trainees, Dr. Carola Duran, worked with him for 3 decades and is now his successor. I've been in contact with her, and here is her comment on her mentor. One of those overseas visitors for a shorter period was Dr. John Harper, who also did a locum for the boss while he was there. And here is John's comment. To return to the International Society. It has played a large part in the formation of national societies and is particularly interested in areas where there isn't much infrastructure. The current president is Amy Paller, well known to us in British paediatric dermatology from her visits to our meetings. And another role is organising world congresses, the next being in Scotland next September. Here is the website for the Edinburgh meeting, and you will see that it is being organised by Professor Veronica Kinsler. During the decade or so after 1973, several further paediatric dermatology societies emerged, and I will talk briefly about each. In the USA, most of the founding members were paediatricians with some training in dermatology. The aims of the society were to develop training programs, have annual clinical and scientific meetings, and a close relationship with the American Academy of Dermatology. The first president was Sidney Hurwitz, perhaps best known in this country for his excellent textbook, which came out in 1981. Other notable figures were William Weston, who wrote Practical Paediatric Dermatology, particularly for paediatricians. Nancy Esterly, widely regarded by their society and ours, perhaps, as the mother of paediatric dermatology, and Coleman Jacobson. Nancy will come into the story again as the co-editor of our journal. The Japanese Society came soon after in 1977, initiated by Yamamoto, one of the enthusiasts who met in Mexico City in 1973. It is large and has its own journal. Like the International Society, the European Society came about as a result of a number of enthusiasts getting together, this time in Monte Carlo, at an international congress. The group was led by Dr. Marc Larègue from France. An executive board was formed. I will pick out those of interest from that first executive board that are relevant to this story. The first elected president was Rudolf Happler, well known to British paediatric dermatologists and who has collaborated with a number of us. John Harper, who went on to become president of the ESPD and organised their 1993 Congress. And finally, Arnold Oranje from the Netherlands, who comes into the story later as a co-editor of the Harper textbook. The Society has aims as shown. There are now many national paediatric dermatological societies and groups within Europe, and the ESPD coordinates activity between them. There are annual ESPD meetings, and you may remember that one was held in London 2 years ago. The current president is Antonio Torello from Spain, and the General Secretary at the present is Veronica Kinsler. The British Society of Paediatric Dermatology began in 1985. The history of our society is, of course, the subject of Dr. Sue Lewis-Jones's talk to follow. I would like to mention, however, that its first chairman was David Atherton. David had recently been appointed as the first full-time paediatric dermatologist in this country at Great Ormond Street Hospital, where he had been preceded by the influential Charles Wells, who had also had sessions at Guy's and St John's. As well as his role in the BSPD, David was on the board in the early days of the ESPD. The first Secretary-Treasurer was John Harper, who also became a full-time paediatric dermatologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital in 1986. I will now turn to publications. A measure of the establishment of paediatric dermatology as a specialty in its own right was the creation of an international journal. This first appeared in 1983. An essential ingredient to its birth was some persuasive correspondence to Blackwell from Julian Verboff, a dermatologist in Liverpool with a strong interest in paediatric dermatology, portrayed here during his time as editor of the BJD. Blackwell regarded it as fortunate that it could take on the journal from its new office in America. The original co-editors were Nancy Esterly and Lawrence Solomon. These were colleagues in Chicago. On the editorial board, Julian Verboff played an important part, and on the advisory board there was David Atherton and Martin Beer. David went on to be an associate editor later on in the history of the journal. Since the inception of the journal Paediatric Dermatology, some other journals have appeared, as shown here. Books are, of course, important in education at all levels, and I will focus on some that have appeared since Perlman's 1960 textbook. In 1973, Nancy Esterly and Lawrence Solomon produced the first ever textbook on neonatal dermatology. In 1979, William Weston wrote his textbook for paediatricians practicing paediatric dermatology. Sidney Hurwitz produced his comprehensive text for dermatologists in 1981, and for people of my generation this was the book to turn to, at least for a few years. In 1985, John Harper produced a text aimed at trainees, and then in 1987, Schachner and Hansen's textbook was first produced, and this was on a larger scale and multi-author. And then in 1989, there was the textbook from Ruiz, Maldonado, Parrish and Beer. From the mid-90s onwards, there has been a plethora of books. Some broke new ground, such as Dermatology and the New Genetics by Celia Moss with John Savin. In the year 2000, Blackwell published a Paediatric Dermatology companion to the Rook Textbook of Dermatology. There were 3 co-editors, accompanying John Harper, there was Arnold Aranya from Rotterdam and Neil Prose from Duke University, North Carolina. It was just as comprehensive as Rook and had some special features. For example, large subjects such as atopic dermatitis were broken up into topics with different expert authors, and in total there were 185 contributors from around the world. This book has gone on into further editions, 2005, 2011, and this year into its 4th edition. Some of the American texts have also continued, such as the Hurwitz book, now in its 5th edition and multi-author. Finally, I would like to mention a handbook edited by Sue Lewis-Jones. This is aimed at doctors who would not claim to be paediatric dermatologists, but are in the front line, for example in paediatric emergency departments, seeing children with skin disease. Initially produced in 2010, a 2nd edition has appeared this year. Beyond the written word is what can come across on a course, and even more so with a fellowship or full training. From early beginnings in the USA and Mexico, and then France in the 1970s, there are now courses of various types in many parts of the world. These, by and large, are quite short in duration, lasting a day or so. In the UK, the first course, aimed at consultants and senior registrars over 2 days, was put in place by Julian Verboff and colleagues in Liverpool. In 1999, Celia Moss launched a residential course for dermatologists in training, lasting the best part of a week, soon followed by a similar course for paediatricians. And in 2002, Sue Lewis-Jones and Alan Irvine in Dundee began their advanced paediatric dermatology course, also lasting almost a week. Since the early days in America and Mexico City, fellowships offering much more prolonged experience of paediatric dermatology have been available in many centres. In the UK, there are fellowships at Birmingham, St John's and Great Ormond Street, and in some instances these can be 2 years in length. And finally, much of the material I have shared with you today is in the public domain. One of the pleasures of preparing this talk has been getting in touch with friends, and I would like to acknowledge some of the help I've had from those shown. I would like to add a different kind of acknowledgement. When I was a trainee in the 1970s, there were no courses in paediatric dermatology, and on being appointed to Bristol at the end of 1980, I took a sabbatical. I had the good fortune to spend a month or so with the incomparable Nancy Esterly in Chicago, shortly before starting at our children's hospital. Nancy was a wonderful role model with her encyclopedic knowledge, her wisdom and her infectious enthusiasm. Her influence has stayed with me ever since. Thank you, Nancy. I would like to conclude by saying that paediatric dermatology is where it is now, a specialty that promotes academic research, rigorous training and dedicated publications, thanks to the enthusiasm, knowledge and hard work of a number of individuals, only some of whom have I had time to mention today. Thank you for listening.